You perform an impossible feat every single day without even noticing. You take the chaotic flood of colours, sounds and sensations hitting your consciousness and somehow transform them into a stable world of objects, causes and relationships that other people can recognise and agree with. This should be impossible. Your mind is locked inside your skull, processing information through biological machinery that evolution cobbled together for survival, not truth. Yet somehow you consistently distinguish between what is objectively real and what is merely subjective illusion. You know that fire causes smoke, that objects have properties, that events happen in time, and you expect other rational beings to discover these same truths. But here lies the deepest puzzle in all of philosophy. How can subjective mental processes ever give us objective knowledge of reality? How can the private operations of your individual consciousness connect with universal truths that hold for everyone? If your mind actively constructs experience using its own built-in rules and categories, what guarantees that your mental construction matches the way things really are? This is the transcendental deduction problem, and it threatens to destroy the entire foundation of human knowledge. Either we must accept that all knowledge is merely subjective opinion disguised as objective truth, or we must prove something that seems impossible. We must show that the basic structures of human thinking are not arbitrary accidents of evolution or culture, but necessary conditions that any possible experience must satisfy. We must demonstrate that subjectivity itself contains the seeds of objectivity, that the very capacity for consciousness requires universal laws that make genuine knowledge possible. Immanuel Kant spent over a decade wrestling with this problem because he realized that solving it would require completely rebuilding human knowledge from the ground up. What emerged from his struggle was one of the most revolutionary arguments in the history of philosophy. An argument that claims to prove consciousness itself follows universal laws that bridge the gap between mind and world. Part 1. The Architecture of Human Knowledge. To understand why Kant needed the transcendental deduction, we must first grasp the revolutionary framework he constructed around it. Kant began with a startling observation that had puzzled philosophers for centuries. Mathematical knowledge seems to be both universal and informative about the world, yet it appears to come from pure thinking rather than observation. When you prove that the angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees, you discover something that must be true for every triangle that could possibly exist. This creates a philosophical crisis. If mathematical truths come from pure reason, they should tell us nothing about the experienced world, which comes through the senses. But if mathematical truths come from experience, they should only tell us how things happen to be, not how they must necessarily be. Yet mathematics somehow manages to be both purely rational and universally applicable to experience. Kant realized that traditional philosophy had been operating with a false dichotomy. Philosophers had assumed that all knowledge must be either analytic or synthetic. Analytic knowledge, like the statement that all bachelors are unmarried men, is necessarily true, but tells us nothing new about the world because the predicate is already contained in the subject. Synthetic knowledge, like the statement that all swans are white, tells us something new about the world but can only be established through experience and therefore remains contingent. Mathematics breaks this neat division because mathematical statements are clearly synthetic, yet seem to possess the necessity and universality that philosophy had reserved for analytic truths. When you learn that 7 plus 5 equals 12, you discover something genuinely new that is not already contained in the concepts of 7, 5, or addition. Yet this synthetic discovery possesses absolute necessity and universal validity that no amount of empirical observation could provide. Mathematics therefore reveals the existence of synthetic a priori knowledge, knowledge that is both informative about the world and necessarily true independent of experience. Once Kant recognized that synthetic a priori knowledge exists, he faced an even deeper question. What makes such knowledge possible? How can human reason discover truths that are both genuinely informative and absolutely necessary? The answer, he realized, must lie in the structure of human consciousness itself. Traditional empiricism assumed that the mind begins as a blank slate that passively receives impressions from the external world. Objects imprint themselves on consciousness like seals pressing into soft wax, creating ideas that copy or represent external things. But if this picture were correct, all knowledge would be merely contingent and empirical, since it would depend entirely on which particular impressions happen to occur. There could be no universal and necessary truths, and mathematics would be impossible. Traditional rationalism assumed that the mind contains innate ideas that correspond to eternal truths about reality itself. Mathematical knowledge works because the mind has built-in access to the rational structure of the universe. But if this picture were correct, it would be mysterious how purely mental ideas could provide information about the experienced world. We would need some kind of pre-established harmony between thought and reality, which seems like philosophical magic rather than a genuine explanation. Kant's breakthrough was to recognize that both empiricism and rationalism were asking the wrong question. Instead of asking how the mind conforms to objects, we should ask how objects conform to the mind. This reversal, which Kant called his Copernican revolution, transforms the entire philosophical landscape. Just as Copernicus solved problems in astronomy by proposing that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than vice versa, Kant solved problems in epistemology by proposing that objects must conform to our knowledge rather than vice versa. The key insight is that we never encounter objects as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive apparatus. Everything we can possibly experience must first be processed through the structures and operations of human consciousness. These structures are not arbitrary features of how particular individuals happen to think, but universal and necessary conditions for any possible human experience. They function like invisible spectacles that we can never remove, spectacles that shape everything we see in systematic and predictable ways. Kant identified two fundamental levels of these cognitive structures. First, there are the pure forms of sensible intuition, space and time. Everything we can possibly experience must appear within spatial and temporal relationships because space and time are not features of things in themselves, but rather the necessary forms through which human sensibility organizes sensory data. We cannot experience anything that is not spatial and temporal, not because everything that exists is spatial and temporal, but because spatiality and temporality are conditions built into the structure of human perception itself. This explains why geometry and arithmetic possess synthetic a priori validity. Geometric truths like the properties of triangles are synthetic because they tell us something genuinely informative about spatial relationships. They are a priori because they do not depend on particular experiences, but rather express the necessary structure of space itself as a form of human intuition. Since everything we can possibly experience must conform to this spatial structure, geometric knowledge possesses universal validity for all possible experience. Similarly, arithmetic expresses the necessary structure of time as the form of inner sense. Counting requires the successive synthesis of units in temporal sequence, and the properties of number reflect the structure of temporal synthesis itself. Mathematical knowledge is therefore both synthetic and a priori, because it articulates the necessary forms through which human consciousness must organize all possible experience. Mathematics works in the physical world not because mathematical objects exist independently in nature, but because the physical world as we experience it must conform to the mathematical structures built into human cognition. However, space and time as pure forms of intuition solve only part of the problem. Even if all experience must be spatial and temporal, this does not yet explain how experience becomes organized into a world of determinate objects standing in causal relationships. Raw spatial and temporal data would still constitute only a chaotic manifold of sensations unless something transforms this manifold into coherent experience of an objective world. This transformation requires a higher level of cognitive structure that operates on intuitions to produce genuine knowledge. Kant called this higher level the understanding, and its fundamental operations are the pure concepts or categories. Just as space and time are the universal forms of sensible intuition, the categories are the universal forms of conceptual thinking. They provide the basic conceptual framework through which the understanding organizes spatio-temporal intuitions into knowledge of objects. Without the categories, we would have only a blind manifold of spatial and temporal sensations with no objective content. The categories include fundamental concepts like unity and plurality, reality and negation, substance and accident, cause and effect, possibility and necessity. These are not concepts that we learn through experience or cultural transmission, but rather the basic conceptual tools that make any experience of an objective world possible in the first place. When you perceive a red ball rolling across a table, multiple categories are simultaneously at work, organizing this experience. Substance allows you to recognize the ball as a persisting object with properties. Causality connects the rolling motion with whatever set the ball in motion. Unity synthesizes the various sensory data into experience of a single object, and reality distinguishes the positive content of the experience from mere absence or negation. But here we arrive at the heart of the transcendental deduction problem. Kant had identified the categories as necessary conditions for experience of an objective world, but what justifies their use? How can we be sure that these concepts, which originate in the structure of human understanding, legitimately apply to objects of experience? What guarantees that the world as we experience it through the categories corresponds to the world as it really is? Part 2. The Crisis of Two Worlds. The problem that drives Kant's transcendental deduction emerges from a devastating philosophical dilemma that had been building for centuries. If our minds actively organize experience using built-in structures like space, time, and the categories, then we seem to be trapped forever behind a veil of our own mental operations. We can never know things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive processing, but only things as they appear to us after being filtered through the machinery of human consciousness. This threatens to collapse all knowledge into mere subjectivity and illusion. Traditional realism had assumed that genuine knowledge consists in correspondence between our ideas and external objects. To know that fire causes smoke, our concept of causality must somehow match or copy a real causal relationship that exists independently in nature itself. But Kant's Copernican revolution makes this correspondence impossible because we can never compare our concepts with objects as they are in themselves. We only have access to objects as they appear through our cognitive structures, never to the objects that supposedly exist beyond or behind these appearances. This generates what Kant calls the scandal of philosophy. Either we must give up the idea that knowledge provides access to objective reality, reducing everything to subjective appearances that might have no foundation in truth, or we must somehow prove that our subjective cognitive structures necessarily connect with objective reality, which seems impossible since we can never step outside our own subjectivity to verify this connection. The first option leads to skepticism and the collapse of science, while the second option seems to require philosophical magic. Kant realized that this dilemma rests on a false assumption that had dominated philosophy since ancient times. Philosophers had assumed that for knowledge to be objective, it must correspond to things as they are completely independent of any cognitive processing whatsoever. But this assumption makes objectivity impossible from the start, because finite minds like ours can only access reality through our own cognitive capacities. We cannot have a view from nowhere that bypasses all perspectival limitations. The solution requires distinguishing two different standpoints from which we can consider objects. From the empirical standpoint, we consider objects as they appear within experience, already organized by our cognitive structures into a spatio-temporal world of causally interacting substances. From the transcendental standpoint, we consider objects as they might be in themselves, completely independent of any relation to human cognitive capacities. The crucial insight is that these are not two different sets of objects, but rather two different ways of considering the same objects. Empirical realism maintains that objects of experience are genuinely real and objective, not mere illusions or subjective projections. When you see a tree in your garden, there really is a tree there, existing independently of your particular psychological states and accessible to other observers under similar conditions. The tree has determinate spatial properties, stands in causal relationships with other objects, persists through time, and would continue to exist even if no one were observing it. This is genuine objectivity within the realm of possible experience. Transcendental idealism maintains that this same tree, considered as an object of possible experience, exists only in relation to the structures of human cognition. Its spatial properties reflect the form of our sensible intuition rather than features it possesses in itself. Its causal relationships reflect the conceptual organization imposed by our understanding rather than intrinsic connections that exist independently of any cognitive processing. The tree, as it is in itself, completely independent of any relation to possible experience, remains forever unknowable. This position sounds paradoxical, but Kant argues it is the only way to preserve both the objectivity of empirical knowledge and the limitations of finite reason. We can have genuine objective knowledge within the realm of possible experience precisely because this realm is structured by universal and necessary features of human cognition. But we cannot extend this knowledge beyond the boundaries of possible experience to make claims about ultimate metaphysical reality. The price of securing objective empirical knowledge is accepting that metaphysical knowledge of things in themselves is impossible. Critics have always found this distinction unstable and problematic. If we can never know things in themselves, why posit their existence at all? And if things in themselves do exist but remain forever unknowable, how can we avoid the conclusion that all our knowledge is merely phenomenal appearance cut off from genuine reality? Kant's responses to these objections form a crucial part of the Transcendental Deduction's argumentative strategy. Part 3. The unity that makes mind possible. At the foundation of Kant's entire critical philosophy lies a deceptively simple observation about the nature of consciousness itself. Every representation that occurs in your mind, whether it is a sensation, concept, memory, or imagination, can potentially be accompanied by the thought that you are having that representation. Right now, you're not only reading these words, but can also be aware that you are reading these words. This higher-order awareness, what Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception, turns out to be the key that unlocks the entire problem of objective knowledge. The unity of apperception is not just another mental capacity alongside perception, memory, and imagination. It is the fundamental condition that makes all other mental capacities possible and that distinguishes genuine consciousness from mere mechanical information processing. Consider what it means to have a unified stream of consciousness rather than just a series of disconnected mental events. Your current visual experience of these words connects with your memory of the previous sentence, your anticipation of what comes next, and your overall understanding of the argument being developed. This unity is not something you create through effort or decision. It happens automatically and necessarily whenever you are conscious at all. But Kant realized that this automatic unity presents a profound philosophical puzzle. How is it possible for diverse mental representations occurring at different times and involving different cognitive faculties to belong together as states of a single unified consciousness? The puzzle becomes more acute when we consider that consciousness involves not just passive reception of given representations, but active synthesis of diverse elements into unified wholes. When you see a house, your mind actively combines various visual sensations of colors, shapes, and spatial relationships into the unified perception of a single complex object. When you follow an argument, your mind actively connects premises with conclusions, relating different concepts and judgments into a coherent train of reasoning. When you remember yesterday's events, your mind actively reconstructs past experiences and connects them with present awareness. This synthetic activity cannot be explained as mere mechanical association or habit. Associations and habits can explain why certain representations tend to occur together, but they cannot explain how diverse representations come to be recognized as representations of a single subject. For all your various mental states to count as your mental states, there must be some principle of unity that distinguishes genuine synthesis from mere aggregation. This principle is what Kant calls the synthetic unity of a perception, the consciousness that can accompany all representations, and thereby make them into representations of a unified self. The unity of a perception has several crucial features that will prove central to the transcendental deduction. First, it is original and underived, not something that can be explained in terms of more basic psychological mechanisms. Second, it is synthetic rather than merely analytic, actively combining diverse representations rather than simply recognizing what is already contained in given concepts. Third, it is transcendental rather than merely empirical, constituting a necessary condition for any possible consciousness rather than just a contingent feature of particular minds. Most importantly, the unity of apperception is necessarily connected to the objectivity of experience. For representations to belong to a unified consciousness, They must be subject to rules that determine how they can be combined and related to one another. Random or arbitrary combinations cannot generate unified consciousness because unity requires systematic organization according to universal principles. These principles of systematic organization turn out to be precisely the categories that the understanding uses to organize experience into knowledge of an objective world. Consider what happens when you judge that some event was caused by another event. This judgment does not merely associate two representations in your mind, but claims that they are connected by an objective relationship that would hold for any possible observer. The causal judgment expresses a rule for how representations must be combined if they are to constitute experience of an objective temporal sequence, rather than merely subjective succession of ideas. Without such rules, you could have no way to distinguish between objective temporal order and merely subjective association of representations. The same analysis applies to all the fundamental categories. The concept of substance provides rules for distinguishing between genuine objects and mere collections of properties. The concept of unity provides rules for determining what counts as a single object rather than multiple objects. The concept of reality provides rules for distinguishing between genuine content and mere absence or negation. In every case, the categories function as rules for the synthesis of representations that must be followed if synthesis is to generate unified consciousness of an objective world, rather than merely subjective play of ideas. The unity of apperception therefore necessarily involves the objective validity of the categories, and the objective validity of the categories necessarily involves the unity of apperception. Part 4. The two sides of deduction. Kant's presentation of the transcendental deduction in the Critique of Pure Reason is notoriously complex and difficult, partly because he is actually pursuing two different but related arguments simultaneously. The objective deduction aims to prove that the categories necessarily apply to all objects of possible experience. The subjective deduction aims to explain how the human mind is structured so as to make this objective application possible. Understanding the relationship between these two lines of argument is crucial for grasping what Kant takes himself to have accomplished. The objective deduction addresses what Kant calls the quid juris question, the question of right or legitimacy. Given that we do in fact use concepts like causality, substance and unity to organize experience, what justifies this use? How can we be sure that these concepts, which originate in the spontaneous activity of the understanding, legitimately apply to objects given through sensibility? The skeptical challenge claims that there is no necessary connection between subjective concepts and objective experience, so our most fundamental ways of thinking might be systematically deluded. Kant's response to this challenge involves showing that the categories are not optional additions to experience that might or might not apply correctly. Instead, they are necessary conditions for the very possibility of experience itself. Without the categories performing their synthesizing work, there would be no unified experience of an objective world, and therefore no consciousness capable of raising skeptical doubts in the first place. The skeptical challenge is self-defeating because it presupposes the very unity of consciousness that is only possible through the objective validity of the categories. This argument has a distinctive transcendental structure that differs from both empirical arguments and purely logical arguments. It is not empirical because it does not depend on particular facts about how human psychology happens to work or what experiences we happen to have had. It is not purely logical because it does not derive conclusions from definitions or formal relationships alone. Instead, it identifies necessary conditions for the possibility of experience itself, conditions that must hold for any finite rational being that receives information through sensibility and organizes it through understanding. The subjective deduction pursues a complementary but distinct project. Even if the objective deduction succeeds in proving that the categories must apply to experience, we still need to understand how finite minds like ours are capable of applying them. How does the understanding succeed in subsuming sensible intuitions under pure concepts? How does the imagination mediate between the spontaneity of conceptual thinking and the receptivity of sensible intuition? How do the various cognitive faculties work together to produce unified knowledge of an objective world? These questions belong to what Kant calls transcendental psychology, the investigation of the necessary structures and operations of finite rational cognition. The subjective deduction reveals that experience involves three distinct but interconnected syntheses. The synthesis of apprehension in intuition gathers the diverse sensory data given at each moment into unified intuitive wholes. The synthesis of reproduction in imagination connects present apprehension with past experiences, making it possible to recognize objects as the same through time and to follow temporal sequences. The synthesis of recognition in concepts brings reproduced past experiences under universal concepts, making it possible to judge that present experience instantiates general types or falls under universal rules. These three syntheses are not separate psychological processes that happen to work together, but rather three aspects of a single complex activity of consciousness. Every moment of experience simultaneously involves apprehending given sensory data, reproducing relevant past experiences, and recognizing conceptual patterns that connect past and present into coherent knowledge. The unity of apperception is both the ground and the result of this threefold synthesis, making it possible and being constituted through its successful performance. Without unified apperception, the three syntheses would collapse into disconnected psychological mechanisms, but without successful synthesis, unified apperception would have no content and therefore no actuality. The relationship between objective and subjective deduction generates one of the deepest tensions in Kant's critical philosophy. The objective deduction seems to prove too much by showing that experience necessarily conforms to the categories, apparently making empirical error impossible. The subjective deduction seems to prove too little by grounding the categories in contingent features of human psychological architecture, apparently making their validity merely relative to our particular kind of mind. Kant struggled throughout his career to balance these competing demands, seeking to secure both the objectivity and the humanity of knowledge. Part of the solution lies in recognizing that the transcendental deduction operates at a different level from ordinary empirical judgments. The deduction does not prove that any particular empirical judgment is true, but rather establishes the conditions under which empirical judgments can be either true or false. It shows that experience must have a certain general structure, involving causally interacting substances in space and time, but leaves entirely open what specific causal laws govern particular domains of experience. Within this general structure, empirical error remains possible and empirical inquiry remains necessary. Part 5. The bridge between mind and world. The success of the transcendental deduction depends on solving what might be called the application problem. Even if pure concepts like causality and substance are necessary for unified consciousness, and even if unified consciousness is necessary for any possible experience, we still need to understand how these abstract concepts successfully connect with concrete sensible intuitions. How does the purely intellectual concept of causality get applied to particular temporal sequences given through sensibility? How does the purely intellectual concept of substance get applied to particular spatial configurations given through perception? This problem is more difficult than it might initially appear because pure concepts and sensible intuitions seem to be completely heterogeneous. Concepts are general, universal and intellectual, while intuitions are particular, concrete and sensible. Concepts are spontaneous products of the understanding's activity, while intuitions are receptive products of sensibility's passivity. The concept of causality contains nothing spatial or temporal in itself, while sensible intuitions are essentially spatial and temporal but contain nothing conceptual in themselves. How can such different kinds of representation be brought into synthetic unity? What mediates between the spontaneity of concepts and the receptivity of intuitions? Kant's answer involves introducing a third element that shares features of both concepts and intuitions. The transcendental schemata are rules for the synthesis of imagination that translate pure concepts into forms applicable to sensible experience. They are intellectual, like concepts, because they express universal rules. But they are also sensible, like intuitions, because they essentially involve temporal synthesis. The schema mediates between concept and intuition by providing a method for generating temporal patterns that satisfy conceptual requirements. Consider how the pure concept of causality gets applied to experience through its transcendental schema. The concept of causality by itself merely contains the thought of one thing following from another according to a necessary rule. This abstract logical relationship could apply to any kind of sequence whatsoever, whether temporal, spatial, logical, or mathematical. But when causality gets applied to objects of possible experience, it must take on a specifically temporal form because all experience occurs in time. The schema of causality is therefore the rule of temporal succession according to a universal law. When we judge that one event causes another, we are not simply noting that they happen to occur in temporal sequence. We are claiming that events of the first type are always and necessarily followed by events of the second type, and that this universal temporal pattern reflects an objective causal law rather than merely subjective association. The schema provides the method for determining whether particular temporal sequences satisfy the conceptual requirements for genuine causality rather than mere succession. The same analysis applies to all the other categories. The schema of substance is permanence in time, the rule for identifying what persists through temporal change and therefore counts as the enduring substrate of varying properties. The schema of unity is the generation of time itself, the rule for synthesizing temporal succession into unified duration. The schema of reality is being in time in general, the rule for distinguishing positive temporal content from mere absence or negation. In every case, the schema translates the pure conceptual content into a rule for temporal synthesis that can be applied to determine the objective structure of temporal experience. Through the schematism, pure concepts become applicable to sensible experience without losing their universality and necessity. The transcendental imagination, which produces the schemata, occupies a unique position in Kant's architecture of the mind. It is not simply reproductive imagination which merely recalls past experiences, nor is it simply productive imagination which creates arbitrary fantasies. Instead, it is transcendental productive imagination which actively synthesizes sensible manifolds according to rules prescribed by the understanding. It shares the spontaneity of the understanding because it operates according to universal rules, but it shares the temporal character of sensibility because its synthesis essentially involves temporal succession. This makes transcendental imagination the crucial bridge between receptivity and spontaneity, between the passive reception of sensible data and the active organization of experience into objective knowledge. Without imagination, concepts would remain empty forms with no application to experience, while intuitions would remain blind contents with no conceptual organization. Through imagination, concepts acquire temporal significance, while intuitions acquire conceptual determinacy, making possible the synthetic unity of experience that the transcendental deduction seeks to explain. The imagination is therefore not merely one faculty among others, but rather the hidden root from which both sensibility and understanding spring. Critics have argued that the schematism creates more problems than it solves. If schemata are needed to connect concepts with intuitions, what connects schemata with concepts and what connects schemata with intuitions? Does the introduction of schemata simply push the application problem back one level without really solving it? And if imagination is supposed to be spontaneous like understanding but temporal like sensibility, does this make it a mysterious third faculty that combines incompatible features? Kant's responses to these difficulties reveal some of the deepest insights of the critical philosophy. The schematism is not an additional psychological mechanism, but rather an analysis of what is already involved in any successful application of concepts to experience. When we recognize particular temporal patterns as instances of universal causal laws, we are already employing transcendental schemata, whether we realize it or not. The critique of pure reason makes explicit what is implicit in all objective experience, not adding new elements but revealing the complex structure that was already necessarily present. Part 6. The principles that govern experience. The transcendental deduction establishes that the categories necessarily apply to all objects of possible experience, but it does not yet specify exactly how they apply or what particular principles govern their application. The analytic of principles takes up this further task by deriving specific synthetic a priori judgments that articulate the universal laws according to which experience must be organized. These principles are not contingent empirical generalizations that might be revised by further observation, but necessary features of any possible experience that can be established through pure transcendental analysis. They provide the fundamental framework within which all empirical inquiry must operate, setting the basic rules of the game for natural science. Kant divides the principles of pure understanding into 4 classes corresponding to the 4 groups of categories. The axioms of intuition establish that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes that can be measured using mathematical procedures. The anticipations of perception establish that all sensations have intensive magnitude or degree that can be represented on continuous scales from 0 to maximum intensity. The analogies of experience establish the temporal relationships that must hold among objects if they are to constitute a unified objective world persisting through time. The postulates of empirical thinking establish the conditions under which objects can count as possible, actual, or necessary within the framework of experience. Together, these principles show how the abstract results of the transcendental deduction get translated into concrete constraints on the structure of any possible empirical knowledge. The axioms of intuition articulate the relationship between pure mathematics and empirical experience that had puzzled philosophers since ancient times. How can geometry, which studies pure spatial relationships through a priori construction, provide exact knowledge about physical objects encountered in experience? Kant's answer is that all empirical intuitions must conform to the pure forms of space and time that provide the foundation for mathematical construction. Every object of possible experience must be spatially extended and temporally enduring, and therefore must be measurable using the same mathematical procedures that apply to pure spatial and temporal magnitudes. This means that empirical objects are not just accidentally amenable to mathematical treatment, but necessarily mathematical in their basic structure. Physical science is possible as exact mathematical knowledge of nature, because nature as we experience it must conform to the mathematical structure built into space and time as forms of human intuition. The axioms of intuition therefore provide the transcendental foundation for applied mathematics and mathematical physics. They show why mathematics is not merely a useful tool for describing natural phenomena, but rather articulates necessary structural features of any possible natural science. The anticipations of perception address a more subtle problem about the relationship between conceptual knowledge and sensible content. Even if all intuitions must have extensive magnitude by conforming to the mathematical structure of space and time, what about the qualitative content that fills space and time? Colours, sounds, temperatures, and other sensible qualities seem to resist mathematical treatment because they appear to be simple qualitative differences rather than quantitative magnitudes. Yet, Kant argues that even purely qualitative sensation must involve intensive magnitude or degree that makes it accessible to mathematical analysis. Every sensation, from the faintest whisper to the loudest crash, from the slightest warmth to the most intense heat, involves a degree of intensity that can be represented as a position on a continuous scale from 0 to maximum. This intensive magnitude is not an empirical discovery about how sensations happen to behave, but a necessary condition for sensations to be synthesized into unified experience. Without degrees of intensity, sensations would be either completely present or completely absent, with no possibility of continuous transition or graduated difference. But such discontinuous qualitative jumps could not be integrated into the unified temporal flow of consciousness, which requires continuous synthesis of successive moments. The anticipations of perception therefore show that even the most concrete empirical content must conform to mathematical principles if it is to become part of unified experience. This provides the foundation for the quantitative treatment of qualitative phenomena in physical science, explaining why intensive properties like temperature and pressure can be measured using mathematical instruments and represented by mathematical functions. The analogies of experience form the heart of Kant's philosophy of science because they establish the fundamental principles that govern temporal relationships among empirical objects. The first analogy, the principle of permanence of substance, establishes that something must persist through all temporal change if there is to be unified experience of an objective temporal order. Without permanent substance underlying temporal succession, we could have no way to distinguish between objective temporal relationships and merely subjective succession of representations. The principle does not tell us what particular substances exist in nature, but it establishes that natural science must presuppose substantial permanence as a necessary condition for empirical inquiry. The second analogy, the principle of temporal succession according to the law of causality, establishes that all alterations must occur according to universal causal laws. This is not an empirical generalization that might be falsified by discovering uncaused events, but a necessary condition for distinguishing objective temporal succession from subjective association of ideas. Without universal causal determination, we could never determine the objective temporal order of events, because any subjective succession of representations could be mistaken for genuine temporal sequence. The principle therefore provides the transcendental foundation for the universal validity of causal explanation in natural science. The third analogy, the principle of simultaneity according to the law of interaction, establishes that substances that exist simultaneously must be in thoroughgoing causal interaction with one another. This principle makes possible unified experience of a spatial world of coexisting objects by ensuring that spatial relationships involve real causal connections rather than merely arbitrary juxtaposition. Without reciprocal causal interaction, simultaneous substances would be causally isolated from one another and could not constitute a single unified spatial world accessible to unified consciousness. The principle therefore provides the foundation for understanding nature as a systematic unity of interacting substances rather than a mere aggregate of independent entities. Part 7. The refutation of skeptical idealism. One of the most powerful challenges to Kant's critical philosophy comes from a form of skepticism that accepts the unity of consciousness but denies that this unity necessarily involves knowledge of external objects. Perhaps consciousness can be perfectly unified through purely internal temporal relationships without any genuine access to a world of spatial objects existing independently of the mind. This position, which Kant calls problematic idealism and associates primarily with René Descartes, admits that we have indubitable knowledge of our own existence as thinking beings, but treats knowledge of external spatial objects as doubtful and requiring special proof. If this skeptical position is correct, then the transcendental deduction fails because unified consciousness would be possible without the objective validity of categories like substance and causality as applied to external objects. Kant's refutation of idealism, added to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, attempts to prove that consciousness of internal temporal succession necessarily requires consciousness of permanent external objects. The argument has a distinctive structure that turns the skeptical challenge against itself by showing that the very possibility of unified inner experience depends on successful knowledge of an external spatial world. The argument begins with something that even the most extreme skeptic must accept: the immediate consciousness of one's own existence as determined in time. When I am conscious of my thoughts, feelings, memories and anticipations, I am aware of them as occurring in temporal succession and as belonging to my continuing identity through time. This temporal determination of inner sense is indubitable because it is a necessary condition for any coherent skeptical doubt. To doubt the existence of external objects, I must be capable of sustained reasoning that connects premises with conclusions through temporal processes of inference, and this requires consciousness of my own existence as temporally determined. However, Kant argues that this temporal determination of inner experience is only possible if consciousness successfully refers to something permanent that persists through temporal change. Temporal succession by itself consists only of fleeting moments that pass away immediately upon occurring. For these moments to be synthesized into unified temporal experience, there must be some permanent framework within which temporal positions can be determined and temporal relationships can be established. Without something permanent serving as the temporal analogue of a spatial coordinate system, temporal succession would collapse into pure transience with no unified structure. This permanent framework cannot be provided by consciousness itself, because consciousness essentially involves temporal flow and change. The stream of consciousness is precisely what needs to be unified and determined, so it cannot serve as its own principle of unification and determination. Every moment of consciousness passes away and is replaced by the next moment. So no element within the temporal flow of inner experience has the permanence required to serve as a framework for temporal determination. The permanence must therefore come from something outside the temporal flow of inner experience, something that persists through time, without itself being subject to temporal change in the same way that conscious states are subject to temporal change. Kant argues that this permanent element can only be found in spatial objects that exist external to consciousness. Spatial objects can persist through time while undergoing various alterations because their spatial structure provides a stable framework within which temporal changes can occur. A physical object like a table can remain the same table through time, even as it undergoes changes in color, temperature, or position, because its spatial extension and spatial relationships provide continuity through temporal succession. But consciousness lacks this spatial structure, and therefore lacks the kind of permanence that could serve as a framework for its own temporal determination. The refutation concludes that consciousness of temporal succession necessarily involves consciousness of permanent external objects, making skeptical doubt about the external world self-defeating. The skeptic who doubts the existence of external objects while affirming the temporal structure of inner experience is caught in a performative contradiction. The very ability to sustain coherent skeptical doubt presupposes temporal determination of inner experience, but temporal determination of inner experience is only possible through successful reference to permanent external objects. Therefore, coherent skeptical doubt presupposes knowledge of precisely what it claims to doubt. This argument has generated enormous controversy because it seems to prove too much. If successful reference to external objects is a necessary condition for any temporally unified consciousness, then systematic error about the external world seems impossible. But surely we can be mistaken about external objects while still maintaining unified consciousness. How can the refutation allow for the obvious possibility of perceptual error and empirical mistake? Kant's response distinguishes between the general conditions for reference to external objects and the specific content of particular empirical judgments about external objects. The refutation shows that consciousness must successfully refer to some external permanent objects, but it does not determine which particular objects exist or what specific properties they possess. Error remains possible about the detailed empirical features of external objects as long as consciousness maintains successful reference to some permanent external framework. The refutation secures the general structure of objective experience without prejudging the specific content that empirical investigation will discover within that structure. Critics have also questioned whether the refutation really succeeds in proving the existence of external objects, as opposed to merely proving our inescapable belief in external objects. Perhaps the argument shows only that unified consciousness must represent something as permanently external, not that anything permanent and external actually exists. This criticism raises deep questions about the relationship between transcendental arguments and metaphysical conclusions that continue to challenge interpreters of Kant's critical philosophy. Does transcendental argumentation establish what must be the case for experience to be possible, or does it establish only what we must believe to be the case for experience to seem coherent to us? Part 8. The contradictions of reason. The transcendental deduction secures the objective validity of the categories within the bounds of possible experience, but it also raises troubling questions about the ultimate nature of reality itself. If we can only know things as they appear through our cognitive structures, what can we say about the unconditioned totality of all reality? Reason naturally seeks completeness and attempts to think the absolute totality of all conditions for any given conditioned object. But when reason pursues this natural tendency to its logical conclusion, it becomes entangled in contradictions that threaten the coherence of rational thought itself. Kant identifies 4 antinomies of pure reason that arise when we attempt to apply the categories beyond the bounds of possible experience to think the absolute totality of the world. Each antinomy presents a thesis and antithesis that can both be proven through apparently valid arguments, leading to contradictions that seem to undermine the reliability of rational demonstration. The first antinomy concerns whether the world has a beginning in time and limits in space, or is infinite and eternal. The second antinomy concerns whether everything in the world consists of simple parts, or everything is complex and divisible. The third antinomy concerns whether causality according to natural laws is sufficient to explain all events, or whether freedom is also required. The fourth antinomy concerns whether there exists a necessary being as part of or cause of the world, or whether everything is contingent. Consider the first antinomy, which presents seemingly decisive arguments on both sides of the question about the temporal and spatial finitude of the world. The thesis argues that the world must have had a beginning in time because an infinite past would involve the completion of an actually infinite series, which is impossible. If infinitely many years had already passed before the present moment, then infinitely many temporal units would already be completed. But infinity cannot be completed through successive addition. Therefore, the world must have begun at some finite time in the past. The antithesis argues with equal force that the world cannot have had a beginning in time because a beginning would require a preceding time in which the world did not exist. But this preceding time would itself be empty of all content and differentiation, providing no sufficient reason why the world should begin at one moment rather than another. Since empty time provides no determining ground for the world's beginning, the assumption of a temporal beginning leads to arbitrariness that contradicts the principle of sufficient reason. Therefore, the world must be eternal and without beginning. Similar contradictions arise for each of the other antinomies. Reason seems capable of proving both that everything consists of simple parts and that nothing consists of simple parts, both that freedom exists and that everything happens according to natural necessity, both that a necessary being exists and that no necessary being exists. These contradictions threaten to collapse rational thought into pure skepticism by showing that reason leads inevitably to self-contradiction when it attempts to think about ultimate questions. If reason cannot reliably determine even basic features of reality, like whether the world is finite or infinite, how can we trust rational demonstration about anything? Kant's solution to the antinomies depends crucially on the distinction between appearances and things in themselves that emerges from the transcendental deduction. The contradictions arise because we mistakenly assume that the world as it appears to us through our cognitive structures is identical with the world as it is in itself, apart from any relation to our cognition. Once we recognize that we can only know appearances, not things in themselves, the antinomies can be resolved by showing that the thesis and antithesis in each case answer different questions. The thesis makes claims about the world as it is in itself, while the antithesis makes claims about the world as it appears to us, so there is no real contradiction between them. For the mathematical antinomies which concern the quantity and quality of the world, Kant argues that both thesis and antithesis are false when applied to the world of appearances. The world of appearances is neither finite nor infinite because it has no determinate size, independent of the progressive synthesis through which we construct empirical knowledge. As we extend our empirical investigation further in space and time, we always encounter more appearances, but this process of extension is potentially endless rather than actually infinite. The world of appearances grows through our synthetic activity rather than having a predetermined size that we discover through investigation. For the dynamical antinomies which concern the existence and causation of objects in the world, Kant argues that both thesis and antithesis can be true when properly understood as applying to different levels of consideration. Freedom and natural causality can both exist because freedom operates at the noumenal level of things in themselves, while natural causality operates at the phenomenal level of appearances. Similarly, a necessary being can exist as the ground of the contingent world of appearances, without being part of that world or subject to its conditions. The dynamical antinomies are resolved by recognizing that different causal orders can operate simultaneously without contradiction. The resolution of the antinomies provides crucial support for the central claims of the Transcendental Deduction. It shows that attempts to extend the categories beyond possible experience lead to contradictions that can only be resolved by accepting the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. This confirms that the categories have objective validity only within the realm of possible experience, and that theoretical reason cannot provide knowledge of supersensible reality. The antinomies thereby serve as an indirect proof of transcendental idealism by showing that the alternative leads to contradictions. Part 9. The ideas that regulate inquiry. Although the transcendental deduction shows that theoretical reason cannot provide knowledge of supersensible objects, Kant does not conclude that ideas like God, freedom, and the soul are merely empty concepts with no legitimate function in human thinking. Instead, he argues that these ideas of pure reason play a crucial regulative role in guiding empirical inquiry towards systematic completeness. The ideas do not constitute objects of possible knowledge, but they provide necessary principles for the organization and direction of empirical research. Without regulative ideas, empirical inquiry would remain fragmentary and purposeless, lacking the systematic unity that distinguishes genuine science from mere collection of random observations. The regulative use of ideas differs fundamentally from the constitutive use of categories. Categories like causality and substance constitute the objects of experience by providing the conceptual framework within which empirical objects can be determined and known. Ideas like God and the soul do not constitute objects of experience, but rather regulate our approach to the objects that are constituted by the categories. They provide principles for seeking ever greater systematic unity among empirical laws without ever being fulfilled by any particular empirical discovery. Consider how the idea of the soul functions regulatively in psychology and the human sciences. We cannot have theoretical knowledge of the soul as a simple, immaterial, persistent substance, because such an object would lie beyond the bounds of possible experience. Any attempt to treat the soul as an object of theoretical knowledge leads to the fallacies of rational psychology that mistake logical requirements of thinking for metaphysical truths about thinking substances. But the idea of the soul still serves a crucial regulative function by directing psychological inquiry towards systematic understanding of mental phenomena. The regulative idea of the soul guides us to seek unity among diverse mental phenomena by looking for underlying principles that connect sensation, perception, memory, imagination, understanding, and reason into a systematic account of mental life. It encourages us to investigate how different mental capacities relate to one another and how they contribute to the overall functioning of rational agency. Without this regulative principle, psychology would remain a mere collection of disconnected observations about particular mental events, with no systematic organization or explanatory power. The idea of the soul provides the necessary regulative framework for developing psychology as a systematic science, even though the soul itself cannot be an object of theoretical knowledge. Similarly, the idea of the world functions regulatively in natural science by directing empirical inquiry toward the systematic understanding of nature as a unified totality governed by universal laws. We cannot have theoretical knowledge of the world as an absolute totality because any empirical investigation can always be extended further without reaching a final boundary. But the regulative idea of systematic unity guides scientific inquiry by encouraging the search for ever more comprehensive laws that unify diverse natural phenomena under common principles. It motivates the construction of systematic theories that connect mechanics, chemistry, biology, and other special sciences into a unified understanding of natural processes. The regulative function of the idea of the world is particularly clear in the methodological principles that guide modern science. The principle that nature does nothing in vain directs scientists to look for efficient causes rather than accepting unnecessary complexity in their explanations. The principle that nature makes no leaps directs scientists to seek continuous transitions and gradual development rather than accepting discontinuous jumps in natural processes. The principle of the unity of nature directs scientists to look for common underlying principles that can explain apparently diverse phenomena through the operation of the same fundamental laws. None of these principles can be proven through theoretical demonstration, and all of them can be violated by particular empirical discoveries. But they provide essential guidance for empirical research by indicating the direction in which inquiry should proceed to achieve systematic understanding. They function as regulative ideas that organize and direct empirical investigation without constituting objects of possible knowledge. Without such regulative principles, empirical science would lack the systematic unity that distinguishes genuine knowledge from mere information. The idea of God functions regulatively by providing the ultimate principle of systematic unity for both theoretical and practical reason. In its theoretical use, the idea of God represents the ideal of complete determination and systematic perfection that guides all empirical inquiry toward ever greater unity and completeness. In its practical use, the idea of God provides the foundation for moral hope by representing the possibility that virtue and happiness can ultimately be united in a perfectly just world. Although God cannot be an object of theoretical knowledge, the idea of God serves essential regulative functions that are necessary for the coherent development of both science and morality. The regulative interpretation of the ideas of reason shows how the transcendental deduction leads to a more nuanced understanding of the scope and limits of human reason. Reason is neither omnipotent nor impotent, but rather has specific legitimate functions within determinate boundaries. Within the boundaries of possible experience, reason can achieve objective knowledge through the constitutive use of the categories. Beyond these boundaries, reason can still provide essential guidance through the regulative use of ideas, even though it cannot achieve theoretical knowledge of supersensible objects. The critical philosophy thus preserves both the authority of reason within its proper domain and the humility of reason regarding its ultimate limitations. Part 10. The Boundaries of Human Knowledge. The transcendental deduction culminates in a precise determination of the boundaries that separate legitimate knowledge from illegitimate speculation. These boundaries are not arbitrary limitations imposed from outside, but rather necessary constraints that emerge from the very nature of finite rational cognition. Understanding these boundaries is crucial for avoiding the dogmatic overreach that had plagued traditional metaphysics and for securing the proper foundations of empirical science, moral philosophy, and aesthetic judgment. The critical philosophy does not destroy human reason, but rather provides it with a more secure foundation by clearly distinguishing what reason can and cannot legitimately accomplish. The fundamental boundary is between the realm of appearances, which can be objects of possible knowledge, and the realm of things in themselves, which must remain forever unknowable to finite rational beings like ourselves. This boundary is not a limitation that might someday be overcome through improved methods or more powerful instruments, but rather a necessary condition that emerges from the very structure of finite cognition. Any being that receives information through sensible intuition and organizes it through conceptual understanding must be subject to this limitation because knowledge requires both receptivity and spontaneity working together. Pure receptivity without conceptual organization would yield only blind intuitions, while pure spontaneity without sensible content would yield only empty concepts. Within the realm of appearances, further boundaries distinguish different types of legitimate cognitive achievement. The categories have objective validity for all objects of possible experience, providing universal and necessary principles that govern any coherent empirical knowledge. But the specific content of empirical knowledge must be determined through actual investigation and cannot be established through pure conceptual analysis. The transcendental deduction shows that experience must have a certain general structure involving causally interacting substances in space and time, but it leaves entirely open what particular substances exist and what specific causal laws govern their interactions. This generates a crucial distinction between transcendental principles, which can be established a priori through analysis of the conditions for possible experience, and empirical principles, which must be discovered through actual investigation of particular domains of experience. Newton's law of universal gravitation is an empirical principle that must be established through mathematical analysis of astronomical and terrestrial phenomena. But the principle that every alteration must have a cause is a transcendental principle that can be established through analysis of what is required for unified experience of objective temporal succession. The critical philosophy secures the a priori foundations of empirical science without prejudging what empirical science will discover within that foundation. The boundaries of theoretical knowledge also establish the legitimate domain of practical reason and moral philosophy. Precisely because theoretical reason cannot provide knowledge of ultimate metaphysical reality, practical reason must take up questions about freedom, moral obligation, and the highest good that theoretical reason leaves unanswered. The limitation of theoretical knowledge creates space for practical faith in supersensible objects that are necessary postulates of moral agency. We cannot prove that we are free, that God exists, or that virtue and happiness can ultimately be united, but we must believe these propositions if moral obligation is to have genuine significance. This does not mean that practical reason operates in a realm of arbitrary decision or subjective preference. The moral law has the same universal and necessary validity within the practical domain that the categories have within the theoretical domain. But practical reason achieves this validity through different means, establishing moral principles through analysis of what is required for genuine moral agency, rather than through analysis of what is required for empirical knowledge. The critical philosophy thus provides parallel foundations for both theoretical and practical reason, while maintaining clear boundaries between their respective domains and methods. The boundaries established by the transcendental deduction also create space for aesthetic judgment and teleological judgment as distinct forms of reflective judgment that mediate between theoretical and practical reason. Beautiful objects and natural purposes cannot be fully explained through either mechanical causality or moral agency, yet they seem to involve a kind of purposiveness that connects the sensible and supersensible realms. Aesthetic and teleological judgments do not provide theoretical knowledge of supersensible objects, but they do provide subjectively universal principles for reflecting on objects that seem to bridge the gap between nature and freedom. The critical philosophy thus opens up domains of human experience that had been neglected by traditional philosophy's exclusive focus on theoretical knowledge and practical action. Perhaps most importantly, the boundaries established by critical philosophy are not permanent barriers that forever frustrate human aspiration, but rather productive constraints that make genuine achievement possible. By accepting that we cannot know things in themselves, we secure objective knowledge of appearances and create space for moral agency and aesthetic experience. By accepting that theoretical reason has limits, we establish firmer foundations for empirical science and open legitimate domains for practical reason. By accepting that human reason is finite, we discover what finite reason can legitimately accomplish and avoid the contradictions that result from pretending to infinite knowledge. The transcendental deduction thus represents both the culmination and the foundation of the entire critical philosophy. It establishes the objective validity of a priori concepts within their proper domain, while clearly marking the boundaries beyond which legitimate knowledge cannot extend. In doing so, it provides a secure foundation for human knowledge that avoids both the dogmatic overreach of traditional rationalism and the skeptical despair of radical empiricism. The critical philosophy shows that human reason, properly understood and properly limited, is capable of genuine achievement in multiple domains of human experience, without pretending to omniscience or collapsing into relativism. This achievement required solving the transcendental deduction problem by showing how subjective conditions of thought can have objective validity for experience. Kant's solution transforms our understanding of objectivity itself, locating it not in correspondence with unknowable things in themselves, but in the universal and necessary structures that make unified experience possible. This transformation continues to influence philosophy, science and culture more than 2 centuries after Kant first articulated it, demonstrating the enduring power of critical philosophy to illuminate the conditions and possibilities of human knowledge. Part 11. The synthesis that creates objects. The most radical implication of the transcendental deduction is its claim that objects of experience do not exist independently of the synthetic activity through which consciousness organizes sensible manifolds into unified representations. This does not mean that objects are mere figments of imagination or arbitrary creations of individual psychology, but rather that objectivity itself emerges from transcendental synthesis according to universal rules. The empirical objects we encounter in experience are neither given ready-made to passive consciousness nor constructed through arbitrary subjective activity, but rather constituted through the necessary synthetic operations that make unified experience possible. Understanding this constitutive role of synthesis is crucial for grasping why Kant's idealism differs fundamentally from both naive realism and subjective idealism. Consider what happens when you perceive a house. Naive realism assumes that the house exists as a complete spatial object independently of your perception and simply imprints itself on your consciousness through causal interaction. Subjective idealism assumes that the house is merely a collection of your own ideas with no objective reality beyond your particular mental states. Kant's transcendental idealism rejects both alternatives by showing that the house as an object of experience emerges through the synthetic activity of consciousness according to universal rules that are necessary conditions for any possible experience. When you perceive the house, your consciousness does not passively receive a pre-given spatial object, but actively synthesizes diverse sensible data according to the rules prescribed by the categories. The synthesis of apprehension unifies the diverse visual sensations occurring at each moment into coherent spatial wholes. The synthesis of reproduction connects present visual data with past experiences of similar spatial configurations, making it possible to recognize spatial patterns and anticipate spatial relationships that are not currently visible. The synthesis of recognition brings the reproduced spatial experiences under concepts like substance, unity, and reality, making it possible to judge that this particular spatial configuration constitutes a single enduring object rather than a mere collection of transient sensations. The house that emerges from this synthetic process is genuinely objective because the synthesis follows universal rules that are necessary conditions for any possible unified consciousness. Any rational being capable of spatial experience must synthesize spatial manifolds according to the same fundamental rules if it is to achieve unified consciousness of spatial objects. The objectivity of the house does not depend on its correspondence to some unknowable spatial object existing independently of all possible experience, but rather on its conformity to universal rules that govern any possible spatial experience. This makes the house objective without making it independent of the conditions under which spatial objects can be given to finite rational beings. This analysis extends to all the fundamental features that make objects count as genuine objects rather than mere collections of properties. The unity that makes diverse properties belong to a single object emerges through the synthetic activity governed by the category of unity. The substantiality that makes objects persist through temporal change emerges through synthetic activity governed by the category of substance. The causality that connects objects in networks of interaction emerges through synthetic activity governed by the category of causality. In every case, what we take to be objective features of independently existing objects turn out to be products of the synthetic activity through which consciousness constitutes objects as objects of possible experience. This does not make objects less real or less objective, but rather explains what their reality and objectivity actually consist in. The constitutive role of synthesis also explains why the transcendental deduction can establish synthetic a priori knowledge about objects of experience. If objects existed completely independently of the conditions under which they can be given to consciousness, then a priori knowledge of their essential features would be impossible because we could never rule out the possibility that reality differs fundamentally from our ways of thinking about it. But if objects are constituted through synthetic activity according to universal rules, then analysis of these rules can provide a priori knowledge of necessary features that all objects of possible experience must possess. The categories have objective validity precisely because they express the rules through which consciousness must synthesize manifolds if synthesis is to result in unified experience of genuine objects rather than mere subjective play of representations. This explains why violations of categorical principles are not merely false empirical judgments, but rather impossibilities that would undermine the very possibility of unified experience. An event without a cause would not simply be an unusual empirical phenomenon, but rather something that could not be integrated into unified temporal experience because it would provide no rule for connecting past and future moments into coherent temporal succession. A substance that could gain or lose reality over time would not simply be a strange empirical discovery, but rather something that could not be synthesized into unified spatial experience because it would provide no stable framework for organizing spatial relationships. The necessity of the categories emerges from their constitutive role in making objects possible, rather than from their correspondence to features that objects happen to possess independently. Critics have argued that this constitutive interpretation makes Kant's position indistinguishable from subjective idealism because it seems to make objects depend entirely on the activity of consciousness. But Kant insists that transcendental synthesis is not the arbitrary activity of particular individual minds, but rather the necessary structure of any possible finite rational cognition. The rules of synthesis are not chosen or created by individual subjects, but rather discovered through transcendental analysis of what is required for any coherent experience whatsoever. Different individuals must follow the same synthetic rules if they are to achieve unified consciousness, making intersubjective agreement about empirical objects both possible and necessary. The constitutive interpretation also raises difficult questions about the relationship between transcendental synthesis and empirical psychological processes. Is transcendental synthesis something that actually occurs in human minds, or is it merely a philosophical analysis of the logical conditions that empirical experience must satisfy? How does the timeless logical structure revealed by transcendental analysis relate to the temporal psychological processes through which actual human beings develop empirical knowledge? These questions point towards some of the deepest unresolved tensions in Kant's critical philosophy, and continue to generate debate among contemporary interpreters. Part 12. The problem of other minds. One of the most challenging implications of the transcendental deduction concerns the problem of knowledge of other minds. If the unity of apperception is the fundamental condition that makes experience possible, and if this unity is essentially first personal, then how can we ever have genuine knowledge of other rational beings who possess their own unified consciousness? The problem becomes particularly acute within Kant's framework, because other minds cannot be objects of possible intuition in the way that spatial objects can be objects of outer sense. We can never directly perceive another person's consciousness, but can only infer its existence from external behavioral signs that are themselves merely objects of our own experience. Traditional approaches to the problem of other minds typically rely on analogical reasoning. I observe that my own conscious states are correlated with certain bodily behaviors, and when I observe similar behaviors in other bodies, I infer by analogy that they are accompanied by similar conscious states. But this analogical inference faces the notorious problem that it generalizes from a single case, my own, to other cases that can never be directly verified. Moreover, within Kant's critical framework, the analogical approach faces the additional difficulty that it treats other minds as things in themselves that lie beyond the bounds of possible experience. Kant's approach to this problem emerges from the social dimensions of the transcendental deduction itself. The unity of apperception that makes experience possible is not merely the private consciousness of isolated individuals, but rather the capacity for consciousness that can, in principle, be shared among multiple rational beings. When I judge that an event has a cause, I am not simply expressing my private association of ideas, but rather making a claim that should be valid for any possible rational observer of the same empirical sequence. The objectivity of empirical judgment depends on its potential intersubjective validity rather than its correspondence to private mental states. This suggests that knowledge of other minds is not a special problem that arises after we have secured knowledge of the objective world, but rather a condition that is built into the very possibility of objective knowledge from the beginning. The categories have objective validity only if they express rules that govern possible experience in general, rather than merely the private experience of particular individuals. But possible experience in general is necessarily shareable experience that can in principle be communicated among rational beings and validated through intersubjective agreement. The very possibility of objective empirical knowledge, therefore, presupposes the existence of a community of rational beings capable of sharing and validating empirical judgments. Consider what is involved in making the simplest empirical judgment, such as that this object is red. The judgment claims not merely that I am having certain visual sensations, but rather that any suitably positioned observer would have similar visual experiences under similar conditions. The objectivity of the judgment depends on its potential to be confirmed by other observers rather than its correspondence to some private mental state accessible only to me. But this means that the very possibility of objective empirical judgment presupposes that there are other rational beings capable of making similar judgments and that their judgments can agree or disagree with mine in ways that reveal objective features of the empirical world. The problem of other minds therefore dissolves into the more fundamental problem of how objective empirical knowledge is possible at all. If the transcendental deduction succeeds in showing that objective empirical knowledge is actual, then it simultaneously shows that knowledge of other minds is actual because objectivity necessarily involves intersubjective validity. We do not need to infer the existence of other minds from behavioral evidence because the very possibility of treating behavioral evidence as evidence presupposes that we are already in cognitive contact with other rational beings. The skeptical problem arises only if we assume that consciousness is fundamentally private, and then ask how private consciousness can gain access to other private consciousnesses, but this assumption contradicts the essentially public character of objective judgment. This solution has the advantage of avoiding the privacy assumptions that generate the traditional problem, but it also raises new difficulties. If knowledge of other minds is built into the conditions for objective empirical knowledge, does this make error about other minds impossible in the same way that the transcendental deduction seems to make error about basic categorical principles impossible? Surely we can be mistaken about whether particular bodies are associated with conscious minds, and we can be mistaken about what other people are thinking or feeling. How does the transcendental argument allow for these obvious possibilities of error while still maintaining that knowledge of other minds in general is a necessary condition for objective empirical knowledge? Kant's response involves distinguishing between the transcendental conditions that make empirical knowledge possible and the empirical content that gets determined within those conditions. The transcendental argument shows that objective empirical knowledge necessarily involves a community of rational beings capable of intersubjective validation, but it does not determine which particular empirical objects are associated with rational beings or what specific mental states particular rational beings happen to have. Error remains possible about the empirical details of other minds, while the general framework of intersubjective rationality remains a necessary condition for any coherent empirical inquiry. Just as the transcendental deduction secures the general structure of objective experience, while leaving the specific content open to empirical investigation. So the solution to the problem of other minds secures the general framework of intersubjective knowledge while leaving specific questions about other minds open to empirical investigation. This approach also connects with Kant's broader account of moral and political community. The rational beings who constitute the transcendental community required for objective knowledge are not merely theoretical observers, but also practical agents capable of moral judgment and political cooperation. The same rational capacities that make intersubjective empirical knowledge possible also make moral obligation and political justice possible. The critical philosophy thus provides a unified foundation for theoretical, practical, and political philosophy by grounding all of them in the essential intersubjective structure of finite rational agency. Part 13. The temporal structure of consciousness. Time plays a uniquely fundamental role in Kant's account of the transcendental deduction because it serves as the universal form within which all synthesis must occur. Unlike space, which is the form only of outer intuition, time is the form of inner sense, and therefore the condition under which all representations, whether of outer or inner objects, must be given to consciousness. Every act of synthesis, from the most basic apprehension of sensory data to the most complex conceptual judgment, necessarily involves temporal succession because consciousness cannot simultaneously encompass diverse representations, but must synthesize them through temporal processes that connect past, present, and future moments. Understanding the temporal structure of consciousness is therefore crucial for understanding how the transcendental deduction bridges the gap between receptivity and spontaneity, between given intuitions and active concepts. The temporal character of synthesis creates what Kant calls the paradox of inner sense. For consciousness to be aware of its own synthetic activity, it must be able to make that activity an object of inner intuition, which means representing it as occurring in time. But the synthetic activity that constitutes temporal experience cannot itself occur in time in the same way that empirical events occur in time, because it is the activity through which temporal experience gets constituted in the first place. This creates a complex reflexive structure in which consciousness must use temporal synthesis to become aware of its own temporal synthesis, leading to questions about whether consciousness can ever achieve complete self-transparency or must remain partially opaque to itself. The problem becomes more acute when we consider that the unity of apperception, which is the ultimate ground of all synthesis, seems to require a kind of non-temporal self-awareness that transcends the temporal flow of empirical consciousness. The I think that can accompany all representations cannot itself be just another temporal representation because it is the condition that makes temporal representations possible. Yet this transcendental ego cannot be a substantial soul existing outside time, because that would violate the critical restriction of knowledge to possible experience. Kant struggles throughout the critical philosophy to articulate a conception of transcendental self-consciousness that is neither temporally conditioned like empirical consciousness, nor substantially real like traditional conceptions of the soul. The temporal structure of synthesis also explains why imagination plays such a crucial mediating role in the transcendental deduction. Imagination is the faculty that can hold past representations in present consciousness while anticipating future representations, making it possible to synthesize temporal succession into unified temporal wholes. Without imagination, consciousness would be confined to the immediate present moment, and could never achieve the temporal extension necessary for recognizing objects that persist through time or following arguments that develop through temporal sequences. But imagination must operate according to rules if its synthetic activity is to generate objective knowledge rather than mere subjective fantasy, and these rules are provided by the categories of the understanding. The schematization process that applies categories to temporal experience essentially involves what Kant calls the transcendental determination of time. Each category gets translated into a rule for producing specific temporal patterns that can serve as the sensible conditions under which the category applies to objects of experience. The schema of substance is permanence in time, the schema of causality is regular temporal succession, the schema of community is simultaneous temporal coexistence, and so forth. Through schematization, the purely intellectual content of the categories gets temporalized in ways that make the categories applicable to the temporal flow of empirical experience. This temporal interpretation of the categories has important implications for understanding what kinds of knowledge the transcendental deduction makes possible. The deduction establishes that empirical objects must conform to categorical principles, but it does not establish timeless truths about eternal objects. Instead, it establishes temporal principles that govern how objects must behave within the temporal flow of experience if they are to count as genuine objects rather than mere subjective illusions. Causal necessity, for example, is not a timeless logical relationship, but rather a temporal pattern that connects past and future states of objects in rule-governed ways that make temporal experience coherent and predictable. The temporal structure of consciousness also helps explain why Kant insists that the transcendental deduction cannot be a purely logical or analytical argument, but must involve what he calls transcendental synthesis a priori. Logical analysis can reveal what is contained in given concepts, but it cannot explain how diverse temporal representations get synthesized into unified temporal experience. Transcendental synthesis involves the active production of temporal unity according to rules that cannot be derived from purely logical principles, but must be discovered through analysis of what is required for temporal consciousness to be possible. The transcendental deduction is therefore neither purely logical nor purely empirical, but rather transcendental, concerned with the a priori conditions that make empirical temporal experience possible. Critics have questioned whether Kant's emphasis on temporal synthesis leads to a problematic psychologization of what should be purely logical relationships. If the categories are valid because they express necessary features of temporal consciousness, does this make their validity dependent on contingent facts about how human psychology happens to work? Kant's response is that temporal synthesis is not a contingent psychological mechanism, but rather a necessary structure of any finite rational cognition that receives information through sensible intuition. The temporal character of synthesis reflects not accidental features of human psychology, but rather necessary limitations of any finite cognition that must process information sequentially rather than grasping everything simultaneously. This connects with broader questions about the relationship between the transcendental deduction and empirical psychology that continue to challenge interpreters of Kant's critical philosophy. Does the deduction describe actual psychological processes that occur in human minds, or does it provide a purely philosophical analysis of logical conditions that empirical psychology must presuppose? How should we understand the relationship between the transcendental structures revealed by critical philosophy and the empirical findings of psychological and cognitive science? These questions point toward ongoing debates about the proper interpretation and contemporary relevance of Kant's transcendental method. Part 14. The unity of theoretical and practical reason. Although the transcendental deduction is primarily concerned with theoretical knowledge, its implications extend far beyond the domain of empirical science to encompass practical reason and moral philosophy. The same rational capacities that make objective empirical knowledge possible also make moral agency and practical judgment possible, suggesting that theoretical and practical reason are not completely separate faculties, but rather different employments of a single underlying rational capacity. Understanding this unity is crucial for grasping how Kant's critical philosophy provides a comprehensive account of human rationality that encompasses both our capacity to know the empirical world and our capacity to act as moral agents within that world. The transcendental deduction therefore establishes not only the foundations of empirical knowledge, but also the foundations of moral philosophy and practical life. The connection between theoretical and practical reason emerges most clearly in Kant's account of the spontaneity that underlies both empirical judgment and moral action. When I judge that an event has a cause, I'm not simply registering a passive impression, but rather actively applying a concept according to rules that I give to myself through the spontaneous activity of the understanding. When I act from moral duty, I am not simply following natural impulses, but rather actively applying practical principles according to rules that I give to myself through the spontaneous activity of practical reason. In both cases, rationality involves a kind of self-legislation in which reason provides principles for its own employment, rather than being determined by external authorities or natural mechanisms. This parallel between theoretical and practical spontaneity explains why freedom becomes such a central concern for Kant's critical philosophy. The same capacity for self-determination that makes objective empirical judgment possible also makes moral responsibility possible. If we were simply passive recipients of sensory impressions with no capacity for spontaneous conceptual organization, we could have no objective empirical knowledge because objectivity requires the active application of universal rules to particular cases. But if we are capable of the spontaneous activity required for objective empirical knowledge, then we also possess the capacity for moral agency, because moral agency requires the same kind of spontaneous self-determination. The categories that govern empirical judgment have practical analogues that govern moral judgment. Just as the category of causality requires that every empirical event occur according to universal natural laws, so the categorical imperative requires that every moral action conform to universal moral laws. Just as the category of substance requires permanent substrates that persist through empirical change, so moral agency requires rational agents who maintain their identity and responsibility through temporal succession. Just as the category of community requires that empirical substances interact according to reciprocal causal relationships, so moral community requires that rational agents treat each other according to reciprocal principles of respect and justice. The unity of theoretical and practical reason also helps explain why Kant treats freedom as both a limiting concept for theoretical knowledge and a foundational concept for practical philosophy. From the theoretical standpoint, we cannot prove that we are free because freedom would involve a kind of causality that lies beyond the bounds of possible empirical knowledge. But from the practical standpoint, we must presuppose that we are free because moral obligation would be meaningless if our actions were completely determined by natural causes over which we have no control. The limitation of theoretical knowledge creates space for practical presuppositions that are necessary for moral agency, even though they cannot be established through theoretical demonstration. This relationship between theoretical limitation and practical possibility extends to the other postulates of practical reason. We cannot prove that God exists or that virtue and happiness will ultimately be united, but we must believe these propositions if moral striving is to have ultimate significance. The critical philosophy thus shows how theoretical humility enables practical hope by preventing dogmatic claims about supersensible reality while preserving the rational faith that makes moral life meaningful. The boundaries established by the transcendental deduction are not barriers that frustrate human aspiration, but rather productive constraints that make both scientific knowledge and moral agency possible. The unity of reason also appears in Kant's account of the highest good as the object that unites theoretical and practical interests. From the theoretical standpoint, reason seeks systematic knowledge of the empirical world, organized according to universal principles that connect all empirical phenomena into a unified scientific understanding. From the practical standpoint, reason seeks the realization of moral good in the empirical world through actions that conform to universal principles of justice and virtue. The highest good represents the ideal of a world in which theoretical knowledge and practical virtue are perfectly harmonized, in which scientific understanding serves moral purposes and moral action is guided by scientific knowledge. Although this ideal can never be fully realized within the bounds of empirical experience, it serves a crucial regulative function by providing a unifying goal toward which both theoretical and practical reason can strive. In the theoretical domain, it encourages scientific inquiry that serves human welfare rather than merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. In the practical domain, it encourages moral action that takes account of empirical realities rather than pursuing abstract principles without regard for their consequences. The highest good thus provides a principle of unity that prevents the fragmentation of human reason into disconnected theoretical and practical domains. Critics have questioned whether Kant succeeds in establishing genuine unity between theoretical and practical reason, or merely shows that they operate according to analogous principles. If theoretical and practical reason employ the same underlying rational capacities, why do they sometimes conflict in ways that create moral dilemmas and practical difficulties? And if they are genuinely unified, why does Kant need separate critiques to establish their respective domains and principles? These questions point toward tensions in Kant's system that have generated extensive debate among interpreters and continue to influence contemporary discussions of practical rationality. Part 15. The aesthetic dimension of experience. The success of the transcendental deduction in establishing the objective validity of the categories creates new problems for understanding domains of experience that seem to involve neither empirical knowledge nor moral action. Aesthetic experience in particular seems to involve a kind of judgment that claims universal validity without being based on either empirical concepts or moral principles. When I judge that a sunset is beautiful or that a piece of music is sublime, I seem to be making a claim that others should agree with, yet I cannot point to objective properties or moral reasons that would compel their agreement. This suggests that aesthetic judgment involves a distinctive kind of reflective judgment that mediates between the empirical judgments governed by the understanding and the moral judgments governed by practical reason. Kant's analysis of aesthetic judgment in the Critique of Judgment reveals important connections with the transcendental deduction that illuminate both the scope and the limits of the earlier argument. Aesthetic judgment involves the free play of imagination and understanding, in which these faculties harmonize without being constrained by determinate concepts or practical purposes. This free play recreates something like the original synthetic activity that the transcendental deduction shows to be necessary for all empirical knowledge. But in aesthetic experience, this synthetic activity operates without the constraint of having to produce determinate knowledge of empirical objects. Aesthetic experience thus reveals the spontaneous creative power of synthesis that normally remains hidden beneath the rule-governed activity required for objective knowledge. The universality claimed by aesthetic judgment also differs from the universality established by the transcendental deduction. Empirical judgments claim universal validity because they apply categories that are necessary conditions for any possible experience, making disagreement about basic empirical facts a sign of error or illusion. Aesthetic judgments claim universal validity not because they apply necessary concepts, but because they involve the free, harmonious activity of cognitive faculties that all rational beings possess. This makes aesthetic disagreement possible and legitimate in ways that fundamental empirical disagreement is not, while still maintaining that aesthetic judgment aims at something more than mere subjective preference. The experience of natural beauty reveals a kind of purposiveness in nature that goes beyond the mechanical causality established by the categories. Natural objects that strike us as beautiful seem to be organized as if they were designed to harmonize with our cognitive faculties, even though we cannot identify any actual purpose that would explain this apparent design. This purposiveness without purpose suggests that nature contains systematic unity that exceeds what can be established through the mechanical application of causal laws, pointing toward a deeper harmony between human rationality and the structure of the natural world. Aesthetic experience thus provides intimations of supersensible reality that remain closed to theoretical knowledge but open to reflective judgment. The sublime introduces an even more complex relationship between aesthetic experience and the foundations established by the transcendental deduction. When we experience mathematical sublime in contemplating vast quantities or infinite series, our imagination fails to achieve the comprehensive synthesis that would be required for empirical knowledge. Yet this failure reveals the supersensible capacity of reason to think totalities that exceed all possible empirical synthesis. When we experience dynamical sublime in contemplating overwhelming natural forces, our empirical vulnerability reveals our moral capacity to resist natural determination through adherence to principles that are independent of empirical conditions. The sublime thus opens perspectives on supersensible dimensions of human rationality that the transcendental deduction shows to be necessary for empirical knowledge, but that exceed anything that empirical knowledge can directly establish. Aesthetic ideas provide another connection between aesthetic experience and the synthetic activity analyzed in the transcendental deduction. When artistic genius creates aesthetic ideas, it uses imagination to synthesize sensible materials in ways that give much to think about without ever being reducible to determinate concepts. This creative synthesis parallels the transcendental synthesis that creates empirical objects, but aesthetic synthesis creates aesthetic objects that stimulate thought without constraining it to arrive at specific cognitive results. Aesthetic ideas thus reveal the creative potential of synthesis when it operates freely rather than being constrained by the requirements of empirical knowledge or practical action. The analysis of teleological judgment extends these insights by considering natural objects that seem to exhibit internal purposiveness rather than merely mechanical causality. Living organisms, in particular, seem to involve a kind of natural purpose in which the parts exist for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists for the sake of the parts in ways that cannot be fully explained through mechanical, efficient causation. Teleological judgment does not establish that organisms are actually designed by intelligent purposes, but it shows that we must judge them as if they were purposively organized if we are to make sense of their distinctive form of natural unity. This introduces a regulative principle that complements the constitutive principles established by the transcendental deduction without contradicting the mechanical causality that governs empirical knowledge. The relationship between aesthetic judgment and the transcendental deduction also illuminates the social dimensions of human rationality that extend beyond the intersubjective validity of empirical knowledge. Aesthetic judgment involves a distinctive kind of communicability that is based not on shared concepts, but on the shared structure of human cognitive faculties. When I share aesthetic experiences with others, I appeal to capacities for imaginative synthesis and reflective judgment that I assume others possess by virtue of their rational nature, not because of particular cultural training or conceptual knowledge. This suggests that human rationality involves forms of communication and community that exceed what can be established through empirical knowledge alone, pointing toward dimensions of human sociability that connect with moral and political philosophy. The aesthetic dimension of experience thus both confirms and extends the results of the transcendental deduction by revealing additional capacities of the synthetic activity that makes empirical knowledge possible. Aesthetic experience shows that the spontaneous creative power analyzed in the deduction has resources that exceed what is required for empirical knowledge, resources that open perspectives on supersensible reality and create forms of human community that complement but cannot be reduced to either scientific knowledge or moral action. Part 16. The historical development of self-consciousness. The transcendental deduction establishes that unified self-consciousness is a necessary condition for any possible experience, but it does not address how this transcendental structure relates to the historical development of actual human consciousness over time. Individual human beings are not born with fully developed rational capacities, but must gradually acquire the ability to make objective empirical judgments and moral decisions through processes of education, socialization, and intellectual development. Similarly, human culture as a whole has developed increasingly sophisticated forms of scientific knowledge, moral insight, and aesthetic judgment through historical processes that extend over centuries and millennia. Understanding how the timeless transcendental structures revealed by the deduction relate to these temporal developmental processes raises deep questions about the relationship between philosophical analysis and empirical history. Kant addresses some of these questions in his essays on history and anthropology, where he argues that the development of human reason follows a teleological pattern that realizes the potential implicit in rational nature. The same spontaneous capacity that makes individual rational judgment possible also drives historical progress toward forms of social organization that better accommodate the demands of reason. The unsocial sociability that leads human beings to compete with one another for recognition and resources also forces them to develop legal and political institutions that constrain natural selfishness through rational principles. Historical progress thus represents the gradual realization in external social conditions of the rational principles that the transcendental deduction shows to be implicit in the structure of individual consciousness. The development of scientific knowledge provides a particularly clear example of how transcendental structures get realized through historical processes. The categories of substance, causality and community are necessary conditions for any possible empirical knowledge, but the specific scientific theories that apply these categories to particular domains of experience must be developed through empirical investigation that extends over generations. Newton's mechanics represents a historical achievement that realizes the potential for systematic empirical knowledge that is implicit in rational nature. But this realization required centuries of astronomical observation, mathematical development, and theoretical innovation. The transcendental analysis reveals what must be possible if empirical knowledge is to exist, but history shows how this possibility gets actualized through concrete human efforts. The same pattern appears in moral and political development. The categorical imperative expresses a principle that is implicit in any rational will, but the creation of social institutions that embody this principle requires historical struggles against natural inclinations and traditional authorities. The development of constitutional government, international law and human rights represents historical progress toward forms of social organization that better accord with the demands of practical reason, even though these institutions remain imperfect realizations of rational ideals. Historical progress in the moral and political domain thus parallels the development of empirical knowledge by gradually realizing potentials that transcendental analysis shows to be implicit in rational nature. This historical perspective also helps address one of the most persistent criticisms of the transcendental deduction, that it illegitimately universalizes contingent features of European culture and presents them as necessary structures of human reason in general. Critics argue that concepts like substance, causality, and individual moral responsibility reflect particular historical developments rather than universal rational requirements, and that Kant's analysis simply projects these historically relative concepts onto the transcendental structure of consciousness itself. If this criticism is correct, then the transcendental deduction establishes not universal conditions for possible experience, but merely the conceptual framework of a particular cultural tradition. This would undermine the critical philosophy's claim to provide foundations for human knowledge that transcend cultural and historical relativity. Kant's response to this challenge involves distinguishing between the universal formal structures of rational thought and the particular material content that gets organized by these structures in different historical contexts. The categories express universal logical functions that any rational thinking must employ if it is to achieve systematic unity, but the specific empirical concepts and moral principles that apply these logical functions to particular circumstances will vary with historical development and cultural context. Causal thinking is a universal requirement for any coherent empirical experience, but the specific causal laws that govern particular domains will be discovered through empirical investigation that varies across cultures and historical periods. Moral thinking requires universalizable principles, but the specific moral duties and political institutions that realize these principles will develop differently in different social contexts. This distinction between form and content allows Kant to acknowledge historical and cultural variation, while maintaining that there are universal rational structures that constrain all possible development. Different cultures may organize experience using different empirical concepts and moral principles. But any culture capable of empirical knowledge and moral agency must employ logical functions equivalent to the categories and practical principles equivalent to the categorical imperative. Historical development represents not arbitrary change, but rather progress toward better realization of universal, rational potentials, making it possible to evaluate different cultural achievements according to how well they accord with the demands of reason. This provides a foundation for critical evaluation of historical development without imposing specific cultural content as universally valid. The historical dimension of the transcendental deduction also connects with contemporary debates about the relationship between philosophical analysis and empirical psychology or cognitive science. If the development of rational capacities follows empirical patterns that can be studied scientifically, what is the relationship between philosophical analysis of transcendental conditions and empirical research into the psychological mechanisms that underlie cognitive development? Do empirical discoveries about how children acquire concepts, or how the brain processes information support, or challenge the transcendental analysis of rational structure? These questions point toward ongoing debates about the proper relationship between philosophical and scientific approaches to understanding human rationality. Some contemporary philosophers argue that empirical cognitive science confirms Kant's basic insights about the active, constructive nature of human cognition while requiring revisions in the specific details of his transcendental analysis. Others argue that empirical approaches make transcendental analysis obsolete by providing naturalistic explanations of phenomena that Kant thought required non-empirical philosophical investigation. Still others argue that transcendental and empirical approaches address different questions and can complement each other without either making the other obsolete. These debates continue to influence contemporary philosophy of mind, epistemology, and cognitive science, demonstrating the ongoing relevance of questions first raised by the transcendental deduction. Part 17. The Challenge of Moral Evil. One of the most troubling implications of the transcendental deduction concerns its relationship to the problem of moral evil. If the same rational capacities that make objective empirical knowledge possible also make moral agency possible, and if these capacities are necessary features of any finite rational being, then why do rational agents sometimes choose evil over good? The question becomes particularly pressing within Kant's moral philosophy because he argues that moral obligation derives from the same spontaneous rational capacity that the transcendental deduction shows to be necessary for empirical knowledge. If rational agents possess the capacity for moral goodness by virtue of their rational nature, what explains their tendency toward moral failure and radical evil? Kant's essay on radical evil argues that human nature contains a propensity toward evil that coexists with the capacity for moral goodness that derives from rational nature. This propensity does not eliminate moral responsibility because it results from intelligible choices that rational agents make about the fundamental maxims that govern their conduct, but it does mean that even rational agents with full knowledge of moral duty may choose to subordinate moral principles to self-interested inclinations. The propensity toward evil thus represents a kind of corruption of rational capacity that is possible precisely because rational agency involves the freedom to choose between moral and immoral principles. The same spontaneity that makes moral goodness possible also makes moral evil possible, because genuine moral agency requires the real possibility of choosing wrongly as well as rightly. This analysis has important implications for understanding the scope and limits of the transcendental deduction. The deduction establishes that empirical knowledge requires rational capacities for synthesis and judgment, but it does not establish that rational agents will always use these capacities in morally appropriate ways. Scientific knowledge can be used to develop technologies that serve human welfare, but it can also be used to develop weapons that destroy human life and dignity. The capacity for objective empirical judgment that makes scientific progress possible is not automatically connected with the moral wisdom required to direct scientific knowledge toward beneficial rather than destructive purposes. The problem of evil also raises questions about the relationship between individual rational agency and social institutions. Even if individual rational agents possess the capacity for moral judgment, their actual moral behavior is heavily influenced by the social and political context within which they make their choices. Corrupt institutions can encourage rational agents to act in ways that they would recognize as morally wrong if they were making individual moral judgments in isolation from social pressures. The capacity for moral agency that practical reason makes possible must be supported by social institutions that encourage rather than corrupt its exercise. But creating such institutions is itself a moral and political task that requires overcoming the propensity toward evil that affects both individuals and communities. Kant's political philosophy addresses this problem by arguing that the same rational principles that govern individual moral judgment also provide standards for evaluating and reforming social institutions. The categorical imperative, when applied to political questions, generates principles of constitutional government, international law and cosmopolitan right that can constrain the expression of evil propensities through legal and political mechanisms. Just as individual moral agents must struggle against their own propensities toward evil, so political communities must develop institutional mechanisms that encourage moral behavior and discourage immoral behavior through systems of law that accord with rational principles. Political progress represents the gradual realization of rational principles in external social conditions that support, rather than corrupt, the exercise of individual moral agency. The challenge of moral evil also illuminates the limits of what philosophical analysis can accomplish in addressing practical human problems. The transcendental deduction can establish that rational agents possess capacities for both empirical knowledge and moral judgment, but it cannot guarantee that these capacities will be used wisely or virtuously in particular circumstances. Philosophical analysis can reveal the rational principles that should guide empirical inquiry and moral action, but it cannot eliminate the propensity toward evil that leads rational agents to subordinate these principles to self-interested inclinations. The critical philosophy provides foundations for human knowledge and morality, but it does not provide solutions to the practical problems that arise when human beings fail to live up to their own rational ideals. This limitation has important implications for understanding the relationship between Kant's theoretical and practical philosophy. The theoretical philosophy establishes that objective empirical knowledge is possible and shows how such knowledge relates to the rational structure of human consciousness. But it cannot determine what empirical knowledge will be discovered or how it will be used. The practical philosophy establishes that moral obligation is real and shows how it derives from the rational structure of human agency. But it cannot guarantee that rational agents will fulfill their moral obligations or create just social institutions. Both theoretical and practical philosophy provide rational foundations, but the actual realization of rational ideals requires empirical effort that goes beyond what philosophical analysis alone can provide. The problem of evil also connects with religious dimensions of Kant's philosophy that extend beyond the boundaries of both theoretical and practical reason. If human beings possess a propensity toward evil that cannot be overcome through rational effort alone, then moral progress may require forms of assistance that transcend human rational capacities. Kant's analysis of religious faith within the bounds of reason explores how belief in divine assistance can provide support for moral effort without violating the autonomy that is essential to genuine moral agency. The critical philosophy thus opens space for religious faith, while preventing religious belief from either undermining rational autonomy or claiming theoretical knowledge of supersensible reality. Contemporary discussions of moral psychology, political theory, and the philosophy of religion continue to grapple with questions raised by Kant's analysis of the relationship between rational capacity and moral evil. How should we understand the sources of moral motivation and moral failure? What kinds of social institutions best support the development and exercise of moral agency? How should religious and secular approaches to moral education and political reform relate to each other? These questions demonstrate the ongoing relevance of issues first raised by considering how the rational capacities analysed in the Transcendental Deduction relate to the practical challenges of human moral and political life. Part 18. The Limits of Transcendental Method. The success of the Transcendental Deduction in establishing the objective validity of pure concepts naturally raises questions about whether the Transcendental method can be extended to resolve other philosophical problems that lie beyond the specific domain of empirical knowledge. If transcendental argumentation can prove that categories like causality and substance necessarily apply to objects of possible experience, can similar arguments establish necessary truths about moral obligation, aesthetic judgment, religious belief, or political authority? The question is particularly pressing because Kant himself attempts to apply transcendental method to practical and aesthetic questions in the second and third critiques. But the results are more controversial and less widely accepted than the theoretical results achieved in the critique of pure reason. Understanding the scope and limits of transcendental method is therefore crucial for evaluating both the success of the transcendental deduction and its broader philosophical significance. Transcendental arguments have a distinctive logical structure that differentiates them from both empirical generalizations and purely formal deductions. They begin with some undeniable feature of human experience or agency, then argue that this feature would be impossible unless certain conditions obtain, and conclude that these conditions must be actual because their absence would make the undeniable starting point impossible. The transcendental deduction follows this pattern by starting with the undeniable unity of consciousness, arguing that this unity would be impossible without the objective validity of the categories, and concluding that the categories must have objective validity. The force of the argument depends on showing that the denial of the conclusion would undermine the very capacity for coherent thought that is presupposed by anyone capable of understanding the argument. This logical structure gives transcendental arguments considerable power when they succeed, but it also imposes strict limits on when they can legitimately be employed. The starting point must be genuinely undeniable in the sense that any rational agent capable of understanding the argument must acknowledge its truth. The connection between starting point and necessary conditions must be tight enough that denying the conditions really would make the starting point impossible, rather than merely difficult or unlikely. And the necessary conditions must be specific enough to exclude alternative explanations that could account for the starting point without accepting the desired conclusion. These requirements explain why transcendental arguments work better for some philosophical problems than for others. The unity of consciousness provides an excellent starting point for transcendental argumentation because any rational agent capable of following an argument must possess unified consciousness. And because the specific logical structure of unified consciousness can be analyzed to reveal necessary conditions like the objective validity of the categories. Moral obligation provides a more problematic starting point because rational agents can coherently deny that they have genuine moral obligations, and because the logical structure of moral consciousness is more controversial than the logical structure of empirical consciousness. Aesthetic judgment provides an even more problematic starting point because it is unclear whether aesthetic experience involves universal features that all rational agents must acknowledge or merely contingent cultural patterns that vary across different communities. The application of transcendental method to practical philosophy illustrates both the promise and the problems of extending transcendental argumentation beyond its original domain. Kant argues that anyone capable of rational agency must acknowledge the reality of moral obligation, because the capacity for setting ends according to principles already involves acceptance of the categorical imperative as the supreme principle of practical reason. But critics argue that this argument conflates having the capacity for moral agency with actually exercising that capacity in morally appropriate ways, and that rational agents can coherently acknowledge their capacity for moral judgment while denying that this capacity generates genuine obligations. The transcendental argument for moral obligation thus faces challenges about both its starting point and its logical development that do not arise for the transcendental argument for empirical knowledge. Similar problems arise for transcendental arguments in other domains. Arguments for the existence of God based on the necessary conditions for moral hope or cosmic purpose must establish that rational agents necessarily have moral hope or concern for cosmic purpose, which seems more controversial than the claim that rational agents necessarily have unified consciousness. Arguments for aesthetic universality based on the necessary conditions for communicable judgment must establish that aesthetic communication involves more than cultural agreement or personal expression, which again seems more controversial than the basic features of empirical consciousness. The further transcendental method moves from the core case of empirical knowledge, the more controversial its starting points and logical developments become. These limitations do not necessarily invalidate all applications of transcendental method beyond empirical knowledge, but they do suggest that such applications require more careful argumentation and are likely to be less conclusive than the original transcendental deduction. Transcendental arguments in practical and aesthetic philosophy may establish important insights about the structure of moral and aesthetic experience without achieving the same kind of decisive philosophical resolution that the transcendental deduction achieves for empirical knowledge. They may show what rational agents must presuppose if they engage in moral or aesthetic practices, while leaving open whether rational agents are required to engage in such practices in the first place. This suggests a more modest but still significant role for transcendental method in addressing philosophical problems that extend beyond the domain of empirical knowledge. The limits of transcendental method also raise broader questions about the relationship between philosophical argument and other forms of human inquiry. If transcendental arguments cannot establish necessary truths about all important philosophical questions, what other methods are available for addressing questions about moral obligation, aesthetic value, religious belief, and political authority? Do empirical approaches from psychology, anthropology, and political science provide better ways of understanding these phenomena, or do they address different questions that complement rather than replace philosophical analysis? How should philosophical reflection relate to historical, cultural, and scientific investigations of human experience and agency? Contemporary philosophy continues to debate these questions about the scope and limits of transcendental argumentation. Some philosophers argue that transcendental arguments can be extended to address a wide range of philosophical problems if they are formulated carefully and modestly. Others argue that transcendental arguments are useful only for the specific problem of empirical knowledge, and that other philosophical problems require different methods of inquiry. Still others argue that all transcendental arguments, including the transcendental deduction itself, rest on questionable assumptions about the relationship between logical analysis and metaphysical truth. These ongoing debates demonstrate both the enduring influence of Kant's transcendental method and the continuing controversy about its proper scope and interpretation. Part 19. Contemporary Challenges and Interpretations. More than 2 centuries after Kant first articulated the transcendental deduction, philosophers continue to debate its interpretation, validity, and contemporary relevance. These debates have been intensified by developments in logic, psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of science that raise new questions about the assumptions underlying Kant's argument and the significance of its conclusions. Understanding these contemporary challenges is crucial for evaluating whether the transcendental deduction remains a living contribution to philosophical inquiry or merely a historical artifact that has been superseded by more recent developments. The persistence of scholarly and philosophical interest in the deduction suggests that it continues to illuminate important features of human knowledge and experience, but the diversity of interpretations and criticisms also suggests that its ultimate significance remains unsettled. One major line of contemporary criticism challenges the psychological assumptions that seem to underlie Kant's analysis of synthesis and the unity of apperception. Modern cognitive science has revealed that human information processing involves massively parallel distributed computation rather than the sequential temporal synthesis that Kant describes, and that much of this processing occurs below the threshold of consciousness without involving the kind of unified self-awareness that Kant takes to be fundamental. If consciousness is not unified in the way that Kant assumes, or if unified consciousness emerges from more basic computational processes rather than being a fundamental condition for all experience, then the starting point of the transcendental deduction may rest on outdated psychological assumptions. Critics argue that contemporary cognitive science provides better explanations of human cognitive capacities than Kant's transcendental psychology, and that philosophical analysis should be informed by empirical research rather than proceeding through purely a priori reflection. Defenders of Kant respond that the transcendental deduction addresses logical rather than psychological questions and therefore cannot be refuted by empirical discoveries about how human brains actually process information. The deduction analyzes what must be presupposed by any coherent experience of an objective world, not what psychological mechanisms happen to produce such experience in human beings. Even if empirical research reveals that human cognition involves parallel processing and unconscious computation, the logical conditions for objective experience analyzed by the deduction remain valid because any computational system capable of objective knowledge must satisfy these logical constraints. This defense shifts the focus from psychological to logical interpretation of the deduction, but it raises new questions about the relationship between logical analysis and empirical reality. Another major line of criticism challenges the universality claims that are central to Kant's argument. Cultural anthropology and comparative philosophy have revealed significant differences in how various cultures organize experience and understand the relationship between mind and world, suggesting that concepts like substance, causality, and individual identity may be culturally relative rather than universal features of human rationality. If different cultures employ fundamentally different conceptual schemes, then the categories that Kant treats as necessary conditions for any possible experience may actually be contingent features of European intellectual history that have been illegitimately projected onto human reason in general. This criticism challenges not only the specific content of Kant's categories, but also the transcendental method's assumption that philosophical analysis can reveal universal structures that constrain all possible human experience. Kant's defenders respond that cultural variation in surface concepts does not necessarily undermine deeper logical similarities in the structures of rational thought. All cultures that develop empirical knowledge and moral agency must employ logical functions equivalent to the categories, even if they articulate these functions using different conceptual vocabularies. The transcendental argument establishes formal constraints on rational thought rather than specific material concepts, leaving room for cultural variation in how these constraints get realized in particular contexts. This response requires careful analysis of what counts as formal logical structure versus cultural conceptual content, and debates continue about how to draw this distinction in particular cases. Contemporary philosophy of science has raised additional challenges by questioning whether Kant's analysis of scientific knowledge remains adequate for understanding modern physics and other advanced sciences. The development of non-Euclidean geometry, relativity theory and quantum mechanics seems to violate some of the synthetic a priori principles that Kant thought were necessary conditions for empirical knowledge. If space and time are not the absolute forms of intuition that Kant claimed, and if causality does not operate according to strict deterministic laws, then the transcendental deduction may establish conditions that are too restrictive to accommodate actual scientific knowledge. Critics argue that the history of science shows that supposedly necessary conditions for empirical knowledge can be revised or abandoned as science develops more adequate theories of natural phenomena. Some contemporary Kantians respond by distinguishing between specific scientific theories and the general logical framework that makes scientific theorizing possible. Even if particular scientific theories violate specific principles that Kant thought were necessary, science still requires general logical operations equivalent to the categories for organizing empirical data into systematic theoretical knowledge. Relativity theory and quantum mechanics may revise our understanding of space, time, and causality, but they still involve the application of concepts to intuitions in ways that conform to the general structure analyzed by the transcendental deduction. This response requires showing that contemporary science really does conform to the logical constraints established by the deduction despite violating specific principles that Kant thought were necessary, which remains a matter of ongoing philosophical investigation. Other contemporary philosophers have attempted to reconstruct Kant's insights using the resources of modern logic, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind. These reconstructions typically abandon Kant's specific psychological and metaphysical commitments while preserving what they take to be his central insight about the active, constructive nature of human knowledge. Some argue that the transcendental deduction anticipates contemporary debates about conceptual schemes, linguistic frameworks, and the theory-ladenness of observation by showing that experience always involves interpretation according to conceptual principles. Others argue that the deduction anticipates contemporary discussions of mental content and intentionality by analyzing how mental states can be about or directed toward objective features of the world. These reconstructive projects demonstrate the continuing philosophical fertility of issues raised by the transcendental deduction, but they also raise questions about how much revision is compatible with preserving Kant's original insights. If contemporary reconstructions abandon most of Kant's specific arguments and conclusions while preserving only general themes about the constructive nature of knowledge, in what sense do they still count as developments of Kantian philosophy, rather than entirely different approaches that happen to share some similar concerns. The diversity of contemporary interpretations suggests that the transcendental deduction continues to inspire philosophical reflection, even as its specific arguments and conclusions remain matters of ongoing debate. This may indicate that the deduction's greatest contribution lies not in establishing definitive solutions to philosophical problems, but in articulating questions and developing methods of analysis that continue to illuminate important features of human knowledge and experience. Part 20. The Enduring Legacy. Despite centuries of criticism, reinterpretation and attempted refutation, the transcendental deduction continues to occupy a central place in philosophical discussion and to influence contemporary debates about knowledge, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and world. This enduring influence suggests that the deduction addresses perennial philosophical problems that remain relevant regardless of changes in scientific knowledge and cultural context, and that Kant's approach to these problems continues to provide insights that cannot be easily dismissed or replaced. Understanding the sources of this continuing relevance illuminates not only the historical significance of Kant's critical philosophy, but also its potential contributions to contemporary philosophical and scientific inquiry. The transcendental deduction represents both a culminating achievement of 18th century philosophy and a foundational text that continues to shape philosophical reflection in the 21st century. Perhaps the most important lasting contribution of the transcendental deduction is its demonstration that the problem of objective knowledge cannot be solved by appealing either to passive reception of given data or to arbitrary construction of subjective representations. Knowledge requires active synthesis that follows universal rules. But these rules must be necessary conditions for coherent experience rather than contingent conventions that might be adopted or abandoned at will. This insight has influenced virtually every subsequent attempt to understand how finite minds can achieve genuine knowledge of an objective world, even when specific aspects of Kant's analysis have been rejected or revised. Contemporary discussions of perception, concept formation, scientific methodology, and artificial intelligence continue to grapple with questions about the relationship between receptivity and spontaneity, between empirical content and conceptual form that were first systematically analyzed in the transcendental deduction. The deduction's analysis of the unity of consciousness has also had lasting influence on subsequent philosophy of mind and psychology. Even philosophers who reject Kant's specific account of transcendental apperception acknowledge that consciousness involves forms of unity and integration that cannot be explained through purely associative mechanisms, and that self-consciousness involves distinctive logical features that distinguish it from mere information processing. Contemporary debates about the binding problem in neuroscience, the unity of consciousness in cognitive psychology, and the nature of self-consciousness in philosophy of mind all engage with issues that were first systematically explored through Kant's transcendental analysis. The persistent difficulty of explaining how diverse mental contents get integrated into unified conscious experience suggests that the problems addressed by the transcendental deduction remain active areas of philosophical and scientific investigation. The deduction's approach to the problem of skepticism has also influenced contemporary epistemology, even among philosophers who reject transcendental idealism. Kant's strategy of arguing that skeptical doubts are self-defeating because they presuppose the very capacities they claim to undermine has become a standard approach to addressing various forms of skeptical challenge. Contemporary philosophers continue to develop transcendental arguments against skepticism about the external world, other minds, induction, and moral knowledge. even when they disagree with Kant's specific arguments or conclusions. The general strategy of showing that certain beliefs or capacities are necessary conditions for coherent thought or experience has become a permanent part of the philosophical toolkit for addressing skeptical problems. Perhaps most significantly, the transcendental deduction established a new way of thinking about the relationship between philosophical analysis and empirical investigation that continues to influence contemporary philosophy. Rather than treating philosophy as either purely logical analysis that is independent of empirical facts or empirical investigation that is continuous with natural science, Kant showed that philosophical reflection can identify necessary conditions for empirical knowledge that are neither purely logical nor contingently empirical. This transcendental dimension of philosophical analysis continues to be invoked by philosophers who seek to identify structural features of human thought, language, or experience that constrain empirical investigation without being reducible to empirical discoveries. Contemporary debates about the relationship between philosophical and scientific approaches to understanding mind, language, and knowledge often involve disagreements about whether transcendental analysis is legitimate and whether its results are compatible with naturalistic approaches to human cognition. The deduction's systematic approach to analyzing the conditions for objective knowledge has also influenced the development of formal approaches to epistemology and philosophy of science. Contemporary work on confirmation theory, scientific methodology, and the logic of theory construction often involves attempts to specify formal constraints that any adequate empirical theory must satisfy, and these constraints are sometimes understood as contemporary versions of the categorical principles that Kant thought were necessary conditions for empirical knowledge. Even philosophers who reject Kant's specific claims about synthetic a priori knowledge often accept that there are methodological principles that constrain legitimate empirical inquiry, and that philosophical analysis can contribute to identifying and justifying these principles. The deduction's demonstration that objective knowledge requires systematic organization according to universal principles continues to influence discussions of scientific rationality and the foundations of empirical inquiry. The broader cultural impact of the transcendental deduction extends beyond academic philosophy to influence literature, political theory, psychology, and popular understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and external reality. The idea that mind actively constructs experience rather than passively receiving it has become a commonplace in contemporary culture, influencing everything from educational theory to therapeutic practice to artistic creation. Even people who have never read Kant often accept some version of the idea that human beings interpret reality through conceptual frameworks that shape what they can experience and understand. This represents a fundamental shift in cultural self-understanding that can be traced back to the philosophical revolution initiated by the critical philosophy. The transcendental deduction thus represents both a historical achievement and a continuing resource for philosophical reflection. Its specific arguments and conclusions remain matters of scholarly debate, but its general approach to understanding the conditions for objective knowledge continues to illuminate problems that arise whenever human beings reflect systematically on their cognitive capacities and limitations. The deduction's demonstration that human knowledge involves both receptivity and spontaneity, both empirical content and conceptual form, both individual consciousness and intersubjective validity, continues to provide a framework for understanding how finite rational beings can achieve genuine knowledge of an objective world. Whether one accepts or rejects Kant's specific solutions, the problems he identified, and the methods he developed for addressing them, remains central to contemporary philosophical and scientific inquiry into the nature of human knowledge and consciousness. In this sense, the transcendental deduction represents not just a philosophical argument, but a permanent contribution to human self-understanding that continues to shape how we think about the relationship between mind and world, between subjective experience and objective knowledge, between individual consciousness and shared rational inquiry. Its enduring influence testifies to the depth and significance of the questions it addresses and the continuing relevance of the insights it provides into the nature of human rationality and the possibilities and limitations of human knowledge.